I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. War fighting, or what looks to be war fighting, in the Red Sea, or, as I learned from Gregory Copley, the editor and publisher of Defense and Foreign Affairs, the Suez-Red Sea Line of Communication, SLOC. This is a part of the globe. It's important for transit, for merchant transit, but also it is a flashpoint in contest between the Arabian Peninsula, the Iranian regime, and the Horn of Africa connected to Egypt. In other words, one great big tangle of competing forces and alliances. Gregory, a very good evening to you. He joins me here in studio in New York. You write most tellingly right now of Ethiopia. I want to start in Ethiopia because, as you know very well, all these dots will connect. The firing against the U.S. Navy warships in the Red Sea, the Yemen civil war, the Egyptian fragility and its relationship to the United States, the pending exercises with the Russian fleet between Egypt and also the deployment of the flotilla of Russian warships to Syria. All these moving parts will connect, but we'll start in Ethiopia. You tell me something I did not know, that Ethiopia has a very incoherent government, at least since 2012, and it has an incipient rebellion, the Oromo Liberation Front. Ethiopia right now, does it have friends in the region? Does it have enemies? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. And yes, Ethiopia does have friends in the region, particularly the Republic of Somaliland, which is not a great power, also Djibouti, and to a degree Sudan and South Sudan. Separately and for separate reasons. And it also has considerable support right now from the People's Republic of China. It did have support from the United States, but that's been evaporating largely because of the mutual disenchantment which began last year, in the last year when President Obama went there and basically alienated the parliament and the population.
So Ethiopia has friends, now enemies. The Oromo Liberation Front, what is that? And rebellion costs money. Where does it get the money?
Well, the Oromo Liberation Front's been around for a long time, and it's been pushing for a separate Oromia homeland as opposed to being a part of the Ethiopian Empire. Ethiopia consists of about 60 different major ethnic groups. The Oromo are the largest out of the 100 million or so Ethiopians, about 30 million Oromo. The Oromo uprising, if you like, you want to call it, or the unrest which is occurring now, basically doesn't have anything to do with the OLF. It's become a widespread popular disenchantment with the government, which is run by the EPRDF, the Ethiopian Popular Revolutionary Democratic Front, which is really actually controlled by the TPLF, the Tigray Popular Liberation Front. And the TPLF was an old Marxist group, and that represents a small fraction of the Tigrayan population, but that was Melis's group, and that really runs the EPRDF. Now, what's been happening is that the Tigrayans have consolidated control over literally everything, and as you saw in the recent elections, the EPRDF controls literally all of the seats in Parliament, either directly or through allied parties. So it's really now moved away from a democratic situation. Most of the non-Tigrayan people, and a lot of the Tigrayans as well, have become unhappy with this autocracy because the country is stagnating. So the unrest started in February, basically when the government said that it was going to expand the capital, Addis Ababa, into some lands in Oromia. That drew protest, and there were lots of deaths, and subsequently demonstrations have been occurring not just in Oromia but also in the Amhara region, and the Amhara and the Oromo particularly have been working together along with other ethnic groups, and so the protests continue to escalate. On October the 9th, the government imposed a state of emergency, the first time they've done that in 25 years since the Derg was removed. And it's not going down very well because clearly the more a government moves into a repressive mode, the more it actually stimulates unrest. And that's certainly what's happening now. Between the imposition of the state of emergency and today, There have been something like 2,600 additional arrests in the country. They've basically pulled the plug on the internet in the country. There have been bans on even addresses aimed at ameliorating the situation and dampening the problem. The Crown Council of Ethiopia under Prince Ermias Haile Selassie has issued a plea for calm and is trying to negotiate between the sides, but the government doesn't even want to hear that because I believe they're afraid that someone else will get credibility from trying to dampen the situation. So the situation is not looking good. The government's reaction has been very panicked and defensive. This doesn't bode well for it. And at the same time, of course, the neighbours are the hostile neighbours, particularly.
Yes, let's speak to the hostile neighbours, because what you've just described is the predicate for a failed state. Ethiopia has enemies and adversaries, and I'll say that Egypt has an interest in Ethiopia to do with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. What is that, and what does Egypt want Ethiopia to do about it?
Well, the dam, formerly called the Millennium Dam, is being built right down on the Blue Nile near the Sudan border to create hydroelectric power, most of which would be sold to Sudan. The Egyptians want that project stopped completely because the Egyptians feel that all the Nile waters, White and Blue Niles, actually belong to them and nobody can touch them. The Ethiopians contest that and say they've got a legal right, which they do, to build whatever they want. They have attempted to reassure the Egyptians that this was not going to interrupt the flow of Nile waters. It probably will to some degree. The reality is that the Ethiopians have bitten off more than they can chew, and they probably cannot afford to finish that dam, so it never will either generate the amount of power that they had hoped, nor will it interfere with the flow of Nile waters to that degree. Nonetheless, despite the fact that President Sisi has been bending over backwards to negotiate with them, the Ethiopians haven't responded positively, or haven't responded at all because they've been so internally preoccupied. And as a result, the Egyptians have returned to their old format, which was to pay for the insurgency groups within Ethiopia, and the OLF, the Oromo Liberation Front, is the key one there.
So Egypt is making it possible for the rebellion to prosper. What about Eritrea? What's its part in this?
Eritrea is the eternal conduit for all funding and support for terrorist and rebellious groups within.
Does Eritrea prosper as Ethiopia fails?
Quite the contrary, in fact, but it's a matter of vengeance now between the Eritrean leader, Isaias Afwerki, who's now got the bit between his teeth, and when Ethiopia refused to play ball with him, allowing him to control the coffee exports from Ethiopia, he's basically declared war on Ethiopia. So it's really a very much a personality-driven conflict at this stage.
We have a conflict in Africa, but let's connect it to the parts now. At Djibouti, which is an ally in some fashion of Ethiopia, Djibouti, there are competing military forces. One is the United States. It has, I've learned recently, just deployed F-16s into Djibouti. It has a large military presence there. The Chinese are building a commercial base in Djibouti that looks a lot like a military base. So, do the Chinese have a relationship to what's going on in Ethiopia? Are the Chinese are now players in the region before we get to the war fighting?
Yes. In fact, the Chinese have the contract to control and develop the container port in Djibouti, but they have a separate contract to build a naval base, a distinct naval and military base on the north shore of the Gulf of Tajura, where the U.S. Special Forces had a base, a place called Obok, and that's now going to be a major Chinese base, and that is being developed right now. This is a direct result of the U.S. government, particularly Secretary of State Kerry, absolutely alienating and frightening the President Gule,
of Djibouti.
Of Djibouti, yes. So,
all right, the Chinese are moving into Djibouti. Djibouti is supportive or allied or in some way sympathetic to Ethiopia.
Absolutely.
And what stake do the Chinese have in the Egyptian challenge and undermining of the Ethiopian government?
Well, the Chinese and the Egyptians are trying to get together as well, but China has been building a massive infrastructural network which goes through Djibouti, through with a rail link to Diirada and then Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia. So that connects those two countries, and then it's supposed to go down further into Central Africa to link up with the trade of minerals and resources coming out of Africa, which would go up to Djibouti or over to Limit and the Kenyan port, and go up there from there to Gwadar in Pakistan and then over to China.
So this is part of China building the infrastructure it needs for the natural resources of Africa. Okay, and now we've described a picture of moving forces. I've left out Somaliland momentarily, but that's not a significant actor in the region. It's just allied with Ethiopia?
Yes, it is, and they've got the port of Berbera, and significantly the Somaliland government, which itself is dysfunctional, has nonetheless rejected Egyptian overtures to support transit of weapons and fighters to the OLF through Berbera and through Somaliland, which is quite significant because that they've turned down a lot of Egyptian money to make that statement.
All of this is part of the Red Sea, the Suez Red Sea lines of communication, the flow of merchants and equipment and warships into the region. All of this fragility right now, does this suit the purposes of the large actors in the region? That would be Saudi Arabia, that there's turmoil in the Horn of Africa.
Well, certainly, I think the Saudis and the UAE, their principal ally in the war in Yemen, have been particularly concerned that Djibouti and Ethiopia might be hostile to their activities in Yemen. The Saudis and the UAE had a big rift with Djibouti last year and started moving their forces out of Djibouti and up into Eritrea. Eritrea as opposed to Djibouti and Ethiopia. So Ethiopia has basically also been a target of Saudi proselytization and trying to Islamicize the Christian country, which is Ethiopia. So it's really interesting. The Saudis and UAE are trying to stop anybody supporting the Zaidi Shia, the Houthi rebellions in Yemen. And by the way, we call it a rebellion, but in fact it's the government forces of Yemen Arab Republic originally, which now comprise what's being called the rebellion against Saudi Arabia. Against
the central government. Now that we bring in UAE, that connects us to the apparent war fighting and the shooting gallery of the Red Sea. When we come back, how this connects to the headlines of the U.S. Navy coming under fire from said to be Chinese-built or Iranian-rebuilt Chinese anti-ship missiles, and how that connects to all of the turmoil in the Horn of Africa. Gregory Copley, the editor and publisher of Defense and Foreign Affairs. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. I'm speaking with Gregory Copley, the editor and publisher of Defense and Foreign Affairs. We've walked through the map of the Horn of Africa from Egypt down, which is not the Horn of Africa, but that is certainly the power in this part of the world, until you get to Saudi Arabia, and we see that Ethiopia is fragile. At the same time, we have incidents over these last weeks of missiles being fired out of Yemen, we're told, by Houthi rebels, supplied by Iranians, who are supplied by Chinese-built anti-ship missiles. The U.S. Navy has responded with cruise missiles, Tomahawks, against what are said to be Houthi radar sites. We also have the deployment of an F-16 squadron to Djibouti to provide what could be ground strike capability against the Houthis. Gregory, this looks like the whole region is darkening for war fighting and also interrupting what you identify as the Suez Red Sea line of communication. That's not good for business for anyone in the area.
It's particularly not good for Egypt, which critically depends on this traffic for its revenues. It recently, at its own expense, doubled the capacity of the Suez Canal in the hope that this would also quadruple its annual revenues from transit traffic. That's not likely to happen in the near term because of the downturn globally, but particularly because of the concerns in the Red Sea. Now, the the situation in Yemen is turning dark because the Saudi-led coalition is making no progress at all against the Zaidi Shia or the rump forces of the Yemen government, which really are taking over. Bear in mind that when President Saleh was retired forcibly from Yemen and a Sunni, because he was Shia, a Sunni leader was put in, that split the country. And the country is split and will remain split in at least two parts.
Retired by the United States in conjunction with the Saudi Arabian and the
Correct.
Gulf Cooperation Council. He was forced, Saleh was elbowed aside, and they brought in their own president, whom they praised and said this was a success of democracy. I believe President Obama singled Yemen out as a success of his administration. Please continue.
Well, yes, in fact, President Obama's view of democracy is perhaps different from a lot of other people's, but this is definitely not a success of democracy. We're seeing Yemen split. The attacks, certainly the Iranians have been brought in to support the Zaidi Shia Houthis, but they're really not the same type of Shia and not necessarily natural allies.
This is said to be a surrogate war,
yes.
And I understand the war in Yemen is critical here, but the firing on the U.S. Navy ships affects everybody. That's Red Sea traffic. That's Djibouti. That's Ethiopia. That's the whole traffic that China wants to encourage. And so why? How? Where are we going with this? Because the Iranians have now deployed a warship with a tender into the Gulf of Aden. We're looking like an escalation.
No question. And in fact, I think we're seeing the Obama administration is going to make a couple of moves before it leaves office, and that is, one, to get direct physical intervention in Syria on a conventional scale, and also to do that in the Yemen in support of Saudi Arabia. These are the commitments which President Obama had made to Saudi Arabia and to Turkey in the some time ago, and I think he is determined to make good on those, regardless of
what would a U.S. intervention in Yemen look like? Is this the F-16s at Djibouti? Is this warships? Or are we looking at an expeditionary force at Sana'a?
I believe that even President Obama wouldn't dare risk an expeditionary force into Sana'a, but probably special operations would initially start with providing extra targeting information to the Saudis because they've been going in blind. It's been a war.
Right, I read that the Saudis were not getting intelligence from us, and
Correct.
That was one of the explanations after that strike in Sana'a that killed a lot of civilians in a community center. The United States said we didn't give them that information. They just hit the place.
But yet the United States said that the Russian attacks in Aleppo were a war crime, but
Right,
if the Saudis did it was a mistake.
Right, so we're liable to increase our intelligence sharing with Saudi Arabia. Will that be definitive? Because the Saudis are looking like they'll die to the last mercenary.
That's right. The Saudis aren't fighting themselves. They're
Right.
putting in other forces. But the question is whether Djibouti will say enough's enough and withdraw the privileges for the US, the Saudis and the UAE to use Djibouti defense facilities.
Gregory, what we're describing is the Red Sea turning into a nightmare for insurance. Are we sending the whole of commercial traffic, when it comes back, around the Horn? Is this done like worse than the pirates?
It's worse than the pirates, but and it could happen. The question is whether this will continue to escalate in this situation over the next couple of months, or whether it will die down as maybe the U.S. Defense Department starts to withdraw its support for these kind of activities.
The Egyptians, can they let this pass? Isn't Bab el-Mandeb a threat to Egypt? Don't they have to control this? You've said in the past that Egypt got badly burned when it interfered in Yemen once upon a time. Is it ready to do that again?
Egypt's already there because it owes a huge debt to Saudi Arabia financially, so it needs to get involved to pay that debt. It doesn't want to. It doesn't believe that this is a stable war to go into. On the other hand, it must have stable littorals to the Red Sea to ensure that its traffic is secure.
Once upon a time, we have a minute, Gregory. Once upon a time, there was a strike, chemical weapons strike, said to be launched by the Syrian regime, Assad, in Damascus. That was a predicate for the red line being crossed. President Obama backed off and did not strike the Syrian Air Force. This missile strike, the U.S. Navy ship, they were attacking several at once. does this look like a false flag?
It certainly does, and just as the chemical attack was proven to be done by the Saudis to enforce that, we'll see the same thing happening in Yemen. The Saudis trying to draw the Americans in for a definitive involvement.
Gregory Copley, Defense and Foreign Affairs. I understand we're talking about a part of the world that's very far away and not in the lead headlines, but you will see that the Red Sea is a threat to the success of Egypt. Egypt is integral to the success of Israel in the region, and the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean is now in flames with the Russian flotilla arriving. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.